Right, thank you all very much for inviting me. And I've left my notes in my coat down there. I am so prepared for this. All right, I'll start off. I'm explaining on there, Chris Knapp, MSc, ACR. My master's is in museum studies, although my background is aviation, so I'm a bit of a hybrid, which is better than mongrel that some people have called me. ACR, whoops, I am an accredited conservator, restorer with the Institute of Conservation in the UK. So I've been around a little bit, for want of a better explanation. Now, I've been invited here to talk about keeping things outdoors. I'm not going to talk about airplanes. I'm going to talk about museum objects. They just happen to be in the shape of airplanes. I am very purist. I do not advocate running museum objects unless you've absolutely got to. And I don't like flying rare museum objects. I was based at Duxford until I retired 6 months ago. We had a fantastic collection of flying aircraft, all privately owned. Marvellous. They weren't museum objects. They were privately owned. I only get involved when they come through the gate as a museum object. So, what we're going to do first, if I can find the right button. Nope. Whoa. So the aim of this is to discuss keeping airplanes outside and to look at some of the reasons why I advocate we don't, but also maybe some of the ways of mitigating that deterioration and trying to control it a little bit. And I emphasised a little bit. You're never going to control it. None of us can control the weather. The only thing we can do is try and keep the weather out in one way or another. As I say, we're going to be talking about museum objects. A quick search on the internet found this definition of a museum. Most recent one I could find from ICOM. A museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study and enjoyment. Now, to me, the big word there is conserves, because I am a conservator. Also, in some definitions I've seen, they use the word safeguard. And that isn't only safeguarding against vandals, thieves, etc., but it's safeguarding against museum staff doing the wrong thing. One of the biggest problems in a museum is the staff, as well as the public. So we're safeguarding the future of that object. We haven't got men stood there with rifles or anything silly like that, but we are trying to safeguard that object in a variety of ways. Hands up anyone in this room whose museum has got more than enough money to do what they want to do and all the staff they need to do it. Yep, that's what I expected. There isn't a museum in the world that has that sort of money or that sort of staffing level. So you can only do the best you can. Now, as I say, we're going to look at this from a museum perspective. In conservation, it is generally accepted there are 9 agents of decay, or in our case, threats to the aircraft we look after. And these 9 agents actually are the same potential problems, whether you're dealing with a button, or the largest thing I have worked on aircraft-wise is a B-52. Just before I retired for the last 2.5 years, I was also responsible for HMS Belfast in the Pool of London, which has its own problems that it throws up. But these 9 agents of decay We all know them, we all fight them, but you don't necessarily have them in this logical order. And some of them will surprise you. Direct physical force, incorrect handling or moving, unnecessarily handling or moving, overcleaning, incorrect display or mounting. Well, let's look at this. Incorrect handling or moving. How many times do you have all the ground equipment and all the tow bars you need to move your airplane? Or the right tow vehicle? Or the right trained people? So that is one of our big hazards. I have had to use untrained people before now moving airplanes, and I can show you the damage as a result. They just do not understand that just because you're walking on the wingtip doesn't mean you're not important. You've got your part to play. I have hit a VC-10 with a Shackleton, Avro Shackleton. Two big airplanes, you'd think you'd see them. But when I was over there, my safety number over here on that wing stopped to talk to an attractive lady. Okay, I can understand the distraction, but there are times when you've got to concentrate on what you're doing. Unnecessary handling or moving. Again, we all do that from time to time, especially on smaller objects. People love to pick them up, play with them, look at them. A colleague of mine was head of conservation for the Royal Armouries in Leeds, and they had a harpoon gun from a whaling ship. They couldn't understand why once or twice a week they would come in and it had moved. Turns out in the end they had to put up a camera. And what had happened was one of the museum assistants preferred it in that position. So when nobody was around, he would move it. They don't know how because it's a big, heavy thing. But this happens. It was unnecessary. He was lucky he didn't knock it over and damage it or damage himself. Again, it's something we've really, really got to be aware of. And one of the problems I used to get all the time was people wanting access to the aircraft. And even colleagues, they could not grasp that, say, a Vulcan was not the same as a 737 going on holiday. You can't go in through the front door and walk right down and go out the back door. It doesn't work like that. So I had to show them. And one of our directors at the time wanted to open all the aircraft and let the public have a look round. How long would that collection have lasted? It just wouldn't happen. Over-cleaning. Again, gets a bit zealous, some people. They're passionate and they really care about what they're doing. They care for the object and they're going to keep it clean, which is a pity because a lot of what they've just cleaned off is the history of the object. They've taken away the patina. There was a story many years ago, a guy in one of the big Russian museums found a lovely silver tea service, all the cups, saucer, everything, cleaned it to within an inch of its life, and it had been deliberately left with all the patina on it. He's probably still in a gulag now because he disappeared. He lost his job. He was doing he cared, but he did the wrong thing without asking a specialist. So over-cleaning is a problem, and incorrect display mounting, excuse me, again, is quite a common one, especially on smaller objects, textile objects, things like this, but I have seen it on aircraft as well. I have seen aircraft around the world deteriorating because they've put on axle stands that really aren't up to it or just not suitable for the job they're doing. Or suspended. I specialize in suspending airplanes. It's amazing how many I've seen. I thought, yeah, I'm not going to walk under that. It's scary because people are trying to do the right thing, but they haven't invested the money and the time because they haven't had the money and the time. So we must be careful. Thieves, vandals, and displacers. Thieves can be members of the staff or the public. I've seen people try and steal panels off of airplanes because they said, I paid my money to come in, I can take a souvenir home. No, you can't. I know of a case of a guy in America who was a registrar for a museum. He came up with this marvelous scheme. If anything had not been seen within 18 months, it was struck off charge, so it no longer existed. It turns out he'd sold 3,000 items before he was caught. The last one being an armoured car, which he sold to a dealer who restored it and sold it back to the police force. What police force needs an armoured car? But anyway, that's by the by. So you can get it. A colleague of mine at the Imperial War Museum, who should have known better, was very heavily into militaria and medals, etc. In a pub in Wales, across the road from a military museum, bought a set of medals from a man. When he contacted the museum to get history about them, they said, they're ours. Their conservator had just stolen them and sold them to my colleague who didn't ask any questions. So you can get thieves anywhere. Plus, of course, all right, it's not going to be so easy to steal a static aircraft, but not all our aircraft are static, are they? And there have been cases of people stealing airplanes, usually crashing them, so you're not going to get your airplane back. Again, vandals can be staff or the public. I have had staff damage aircraft deliberately and damage other objects because they haven't got their own way. We had a guy that wanted to work on my department. I didn't want him because he didn't have the skills or the experience. Next thing we know, he sat on the wing of the B-52 in a deck chair in a beach shirt and Bermuda shorts, bare feet, to show that he can do these things. He was lucky he didn't damage the aircraft or himself, but it happens. Plus, of course, nowadays, with the various threats around the world, I worked for the Imperial War Museum. A lot of people don't like the word imperial or imperialistic, so we had to be super careful. We do get people come in and complain. Also, the word war upsets a lot of people, so we had to be very careful. And nowadays, you just get people think they can go anywhere and make their point. And it happens. It happens around the world. Displacers, objects or parts of object being lost due to poor collections management and movement control. I love the word displacers. It always makes me think of a Disney film, like The Borrowers or something like that. But many, many objects have been displaced in a museum. Not stolen, it's still in the museum, but nobody knows where it is because the people that are moving it are not following the right procedures. If you go in the store and you move that piece out of the way to get to that piece behind it, and you don't put that first piece back, it's now on the wrong shelf. It doesn't take many moves like that for that to be displaced, and nobody knows where it is. Again, with an aircraft, highly unlikely to happen. But if you've got your aircraft outdoors, you're going to have to take parts off of it to work on it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing the winter is quite harsh up here. You're not going to be outside working on your aircraft, are you? So you're going to take parts off, take it into the workshop. If you do not control that in some way, and it doesn't have to be onerous, it doesn't have to be complicated, but if you don't control that in some way or other, you stand a very good chance of losing some of your components. Fire. Poor fire safety, discarded smoking materials, arson, secondary damage caused by smoke and heat. We've all had seen fires around the place. It happens. With the best will in the world, accidents can happen. Recently on TV in the UK, there was a program about fire safety in the home. A house burnt down, and it turned out they had a glass ornament on the window ledge, and the sun coming through, it acted like a magnifying glass and set fire to something. There's nothing to stop that happening in your aircraft when it's parked outside if you get the wrong conditions. Discarded smoking materials, not so much a problem nowadays, fortunately. Fewer and fewer people are smoking. And smoking in different areas tends to be more controlled. Many moons ago, when I was working for the air show at Duxford, a baking hot day, really uncomfortably hot, people were sheltering under the Hadley Page Hastings to keep out the sun. I can understand that. I wasn't going to ask them to move, but I did ask them to put their cigarettes out. I know there's no fuel in that aircraft, but they didn't. We were moving a Spitfire, a flying Spitfire, for a French film company, and I asked the cameraman that was helping us to put his cigarette out because he had his hand on the refill as he was pushing it. I mean, he wasn't deliberately doing anything, but he just didn't understand. Right, arson, it happens. Again, going back to disgruntled people nowadays, there's been more than one case of aircraft stored outside in the UK deliberately set on fire. And I'm sure it's happened elsewhere by people trying to make a point, sadly. Plus, of course, it might not be your aircraft that's on fire. It might be the building next to it. Then you're going to get secondary damage. Or you might get heat damage. It happens. I don't know how many of you are aware with a ship made of steel boxes. There's a fire there. You've got 6 other boxes. You've got to make sure there's no more heat damaging. It will happen anywhere. Excuse me, I'm struggling a bit today. And moving on from fire, water, flooding, leaks, fire suppression, and spillages. Now, you might think, okay, the aircraft's outside, a pipe burst in your museum is not going to be an issue. Brooklands Museum in the UK, a few years back, we had torrential rain for days and days and days. I've seen pictures of their VC-10 stood up to its axles in water. And that was after the water started to recede. So that's not going to do it any good at all. Again, we cannot control the rain. To a certain degree, we can try and control where it goes, but if you get a deluge, you are not going to deal with that. You're not going to cope. Leaks. Even pressurized aircraft leak. So how much rainwater is getting into your aircraft and pooling somewhere? It's not necessarily coming straight out the bottom, is it? So then you've got puddles of water in your airplane, and stops raining. Sun comes out, gets really hot. What happens then? You've got a sauna inside your airplane. A nightmare. You will never win. It will always beat you. Fire suppression. Your firefighters will come along and they will dump water on the fire. They are very, very good at it. They can move an awful lot of water very, very quickly. To a certain degree, they will do what they can to protect your property, but their priority is to put that fire out. There is a lot of damage caused by fire suppression. A different talk I give sometimes is about disaster planning, and fire suppression plays a big part in that because they have all sorts of issues. Spillages. I mean, you're going to get spillages wherever. Again, outside, probably not such a big problem, but there's always the potential. Inside can be a problem. But outside, yeah, unless, of course, you get a fuel tanker going across there, that main road, it has a catastrophic accident and it fills your yard with diesel or petrol or cooking oil. Recently, we had a highway in the UK closed because a tanker had gone over and dumped about 5,000 litres of chocolate. It's hell to clean up. So spillages can be an issue. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. Pests, and that's not only school parties. It's not only children. Insects, of course, get in. You've got an unpressurized aircraft. I remember the first time I went in Shackleton at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, when I started there, and I was horrified. I was just enveloped in a cloud of flies because they could get in. It was ideal breeding conditions for them. And, of course, aircraft aren't just aluminium, especially older ones. Horsehair and goodness knows what else, and wood. So you're going to get insects. Insects then become food for vermin. They pass through that vermin, come out the other end, and that makes food for more insects. So it's that never-ending cycle. It will keep going through like that. Plus, of course, the vermin will start to gnaw away or chew away at the fabrics, the wood, cables, all sorts of things in your aircraft. Now, if you have an electrical supply to your aircraft, so you can run dehumidifiers or lighting or something, that potentially takes us back to fire hazard. So all these are linked together. Never-ending cycle. Then, of course, you get mold. Once you've got mold, again, it can be a nightmare to get rid of. You've got to use all sorts of chemicals, which will then damage what you're trying to protect anyway. And the microbes mold gives off can become a health hazard. And you might not like some of your colleagues, but you're not allowed to kill them off. It's just not acceptable nowadays. Bit wishy-washy, I know. Contaminants, airborne pollutants, both gaseous and particulate, acid rain and dust. Many museums are next to quite major roads. As we are here, we are at the Imperial War Museum. You get all your exhaust pollutants coming down, you get the dust. We're not far from a major London airport, so we get the pollutants from there as well. We fly aircraft, I left 6 months ago. They fly aircraft from the airfield at Duxford, so you get pollutants there. Plus, of course, you've got people, so you've got food waste, etc., etc. And you get the dust that settles. Particulate waste, we see it as dust. It's actually slightly different if you want to be pedantic. It holds moisture. If you've got dust inside your aircraft, it will get wet at some point, it will get moist. It will hold that moisture and instantly give you a potential problem. Acid rain is not such a big problem nowadays, because, especially in the UK, because if we haven't completely done away with, we are soon going to do away with coal-powered power generating. I mean, Norway used to suffer big time from our coal plants, didn't it? Come across the North Sea, rain on their forests and wipe them out. So acid rain is a potential problem. But, again, there's not a lot you can do about that, but later on in this talk, I will give you some examples of things you can do to try and mitigate your problems. Light. We all know that visible light contains ultraviolet light that you can't see, that isn't visible. That will damage things. Now, light. You can't win with light. It will damage your paint, but it's not only the paint of the aircraft it will damage. Any light can get in through windows, canopies, and it will damage other things inside. I have been to Pima many times in Arizona, the aircraft graveyard and the Air and Space Foundation. Usually great conditions for storing the aircraft. Most of their things are outside in the Air and Space Museum there. I've been to Tucson 10 times in the desert. 8 of those times it has rained. I don't think it's me, but friends there that are gardeners have asked me to go more often. So what they've done, that because of the light, I mean, bright desert sunshine, trashes of paint, but they've painted the inside of their canopies to try and protect the interior a bit more. I can understand why they're doing it. My personal opinion is I don't like it. It doesn't look right. But I understand why they are doing it. And in our world, we have got to be pragmatic. We've got to realize that we cannot do everything. Even if we had all the money and all the staff, we cannot do everything. So light is a potential problem. Temperature. Too low may cause brittleness. Too high may encourage mold growth or chemical reaction. Do you realize that a 10 degrees centigrade increase in temperature on average doubles the rate of corrosion? It gives the energy to that chemical reaction. So if your temperature goes up by 20 degrees, which in the UK has happened within a couple of weeks, our weather has gone crazy, you have just quadrupled your rate of corrosion. It's a problem I don't know how you're going to deal with, but fluctuating temperature can cause expansion and contraction of objects, leading to more damage anyway. If you're out in the bright sunshine, I mean, here is quite mild, quite pleasant at the moment. Have you had a good summer? Really hot, warm summer. So somebody was telling me that it's not unusual to go down to about 20 degrees, minus 20 degrees. That's a big fluctuation, isn't it? There's a lot of damage potential there. But also, things like canopies, any plastic components, or rubber get really, really brittle as it gets really, really cold. And it's easy to break them, and it's easy to damage them. And rubber components, more than anything, are the hardest to replace if you've got to manufacture them. It can be done, but it takes time and money. Everything takes money. Money is time, time is money. So that's how that happens. So you have to be very, very careful on that one. And finally, too high allows mold growth and or rot. Too low can dry out fragile materials. But fluctuating relative humidity can cause expansion and contraction, which may lead to compression set in wooden fittings. Does anyone know what compression set is? As you're at a cellular level, your wood will pick up moisture and it will expand. Then it will dry out and it will expand. But that part of the wooden joint and that part both want to expand the same way. And eventually, you start causing damage on a cellular level. So you end up with a loose joint. And you haven't done anything. So you don't have to mishandle something to cause damage. That is a potential problem. People ask me what relative humidity, what RH level we should aim for. Very, very difficult to say. It depends on the object you have. The ideal conditions for conservation are a freezing cold, pitch black, vacuum. Does nothing to help our colleagues in display or interpretation, but hey, we can keep our airplanes forever. So it is very, very difficult. Most places will aim for around 60 degrees. Try and avoid 75 or above. Try and avoid 45 or below, unless you are talking pure metal. The big thing is stop that fluctuation. Or if you cannot stop it, try and even it out so it's relatively gentle, not overnight. The hangars I used to work in were built in 1917. They got heating in 1996. Prior to that, you could go in the morning and the condensation was dripping off of objects. And there was nothing we could do about it. It was an absolute nightmare. So humidity is a big, big problem. Apart from the fact, of course, we can create our own humidity with the rain leaking in, then getting hot and causing your sauna. So all these things, as I say, are linked. Right, as well as the risk to the aircraft, there's a potential risk to our visitors and our staff. I know that by the time the visitors get that far, they've already paid, but we still want them to come back again and pay a second time. So we try not to injure them or kill them off. They really don't like it, and it's bad publicity. We've already discussed the causes of damage to the aircraft, so what are the results? Structural integrity. Is your aircraft safe? Is a wing about to fall off? Or are components going to fall off? And it does happen. I have seen it. I have seen the result. Is there potential for catastrophic failure? Not just a panel dropping off, but a wing falling off or a tailplane falling off. Again, I've seen aircraft where I've looked at it and I thought, I'm not going anywhere near that until it's made safe. Plus, do you have the manpower and skills to regularly inspect and repair any damage you find? It's all well and good saying, oh yeah, well, we look at it every year. Well, what do you do about it? Do you just record that you've got a problem and wait till it falls off? Is that somebody's watch? Am I running late? No. It's not the bells of St. No, okay. All right. So you structural integrity of your object obviously is very, very important, and it does affect safety. In the EU, we have all the health and safety regulations. It can be quite onerous at times, but they don't have to be as long as you use them as a tool. So we do our risk assessments, but you've got to show that you've done it. You've got to use it. It's no good giving somebody a piece of paper and saying, yep, we identified a hazard. If you don't do something about that hazard, that piece of paper is useless. So bear all this in mind, and it's usually in areas you cannot see. Not long after I joined the museum in 1990, prior to that I'd been a senior aircraft inspector for British Aerospace. I was asked to do a survey on a Comet 2R, a RAF radar aircraft. Looked great, go in the cockpit, looked great, because most people, when they go along for the Sunday for their bit of enjoyment, they will do the bits that are sexy and nice and easy to get to. The hard parts get left. And again, I've seen that all over the world. It happens, and we all have a tendency to do that. But yeah, you can have things fall apart on you suddenly, or when you're about to move your aircraft and you suddenly alter the stresses in that airframe. Surface coatings. You will lose your surface coatings. Easy as that. Eventually, you will lose it. So if you've got a significant aircraft with historic content, you don't want to put it outside. You will lose that paint finish. On many, many occasions, I have had to treat paint as sacrificial. Not through choice, but it's been so badly damaged, it's no longer doing the job it's meant to do. If anything, it's doing the opposite, and it's holding moisture against the airframe. But you will lose that surface coating. Plus, of course, do you really want to paint your airplanes outside? Sometimes if you want to paint your aircraft outside, the wind comes up, you've suddenly got a non-slip coating, haven't you? You get dust, twigs, leaves, and goodness knows what else. And we'd get in trouble. If I tried to spray an aircraft outdoors nowadays, I would get in trouble. So I would have to roller it. You're not going to get your feather edge on your camouflage markings then. So there's more and more things that will build up all the time you've got to take into account. Systems. Systems in the aircraft have the potential to become dangerous in their own right. They're usually the things that get left in a lot of places. Have you depressurized your hydraulic system? Most people will say yes. Including the accumulators? Most people will say no. Now, When I did the survey on the Comet, I found 3 large hydraulic accumulators buried down in the fuselage that still had 600 pounds per square inch pressure in them, quietly fizzing away. In all probability, they would just produce a pinprick hole and just gradually depressurize themselves. But they might not. They might go bang, with the resulting damage to the object and anyone that happens to be nearby, because that would put an awful lot of shrapnel flying around. So most people don't think of that. Have you drained the fluid? Most people say, oh yeah, but they haven't. Not all of it. They haven't drained the bits where gravity holds it down in loops or anywhere like that. Or in a reservoir, they've maybe emptied the reservoir, but the pipelines are still full. Of course, there is then the risk of injury from hydraulic fluid. And although they say hydraulic fluid will not burn, it will if it's pressurized and vaporized. So you want to get rid of that. Plus, of course, if it starts dripping out, it's a slip hazard wherever you go. I've seen so many people slip over on hydraulic fluid because it's great. You move the aircraft, the attitude changes slightly, and more oil would drip out of somewhere else. And unless you strip the whole aircraft down and flush out every hydraulic component and the fuselage structure and the wing structure, where over the years that fluid has accumulated, you're always going to have that issue. LOX, liquid oxygen. Is that depressurized? Most of us, I would like to think, have had the sense to do that as a matter of priority. But again, I used to be on the board for the British Aviation Preservation Council. And some of the museums there were very small, maybe half a dozen guys running a small museum because they're enthusiasts, but not engineers. They did not understand the potential risk with liquid oxygen systems. Pressurized blowdown system. I've put that there because I ran into this problem. I recently took an A10 down out of the roof of a museum. I could get the main gears down. I couldn't get the nose. We had to, fortunately, we could open the door, and we had to go in and we had to charge an accumulator. No, sorry, we didn't get the main down. We didn't get any of them down. We had to go in, charge an accumulator to blow the undercarriage down. How many of you would think, actually, when I'm putting that aircraft on display on a plinth out there, is there pressure in that blowdown system? So you've really got to look at all these things. I believe the expression I heard one time was, you've got to think sideways. Don't just look at the obvious, look around you. Undercarriage wheels and tyres. The alighting gear of an aircraft also has a potential raft of hazards. Are the tyres in good condition? Can they take the pressure? Especially high pressure tyres for jets and such like, there is a potential explosive force in those tyres that's quite horrific. That is why in services we all know you charge or you inflate your tyres in a cage. And that's when everything's being regularly serviced. I bet very few of you actually do that in your museums nowadays. Before I retired, I was investigating using ballistic blankets, the bomb disposal people use nowadays. Therefore, I wouldn't have had to have nearly 100 different size cages for 100 different airplanes. Unfortunately, I left before I could finish doing it. But are the wheel rims sound? Now, the bead of the tyre sits on the rim and it holds moisture. And most of the tyre or wheel failure I have seen is at that point. That's where it corrodes. Later on, I've got a photograph to show you of a badly corroded wheel rim. And that wheel would have had 265 psi in it. It will make your blood run cold. But again, wheels, please make sure you service them regularly, or inspect them to make sure they don't need servicing. But oleos as well, on your undercarriage leg, are they sound? Are they holding pressure? Are your seals good? Because it's not unusual for them to jam when they slowly depressurize. Then you move it and they give way with a oomph. They will suddenly go down. I like to block oleos. The aircraft with a deflated oleo doesn't look right. Trying to keep it inflated in a museum environment is not really practical. So I like to block them. But then you've got to be careful what you block them with so you don't get that shock every time you move it. But again, very high pressure. They could fail quite easily, especially seeing as a lot would be made of magnesium. Corrodes quite nicely. So is there pressure in your oleos? Check it. If there's not, why is it still extended? Get some jacks under it and sort it out ASAP, or as soon as practical. Pyrotechnics. Ejection seats, emergency jettison systems, weapons and flares, etc. I used to have a standing order for my staff that all ejection seats are assumed live. Even though I had a free from explosive certificate for every seat, I insisted they were assumed live, and we had the pins in every mechanism, wire locked in, so they couldn't accidentally fall out. A couple of reasons for that. One, we may get a new aircraft in to go on display, and we haven't had time to make sure the seat has had all the pyrotechnics removed. B, it's not always pyrotechnics. There are some nasty springs there that will hurt if you get it wrong. And C, they have air shows at Duxford, and the guys that used to work for me work the air show, so they will be working with live aircraft with live seats. So ejection seats are, I mean, we all know that sadly people have died in service by getting it wrong with ejection seats. In the hangar my guys used to work in, or still work in, I don't, there's two crosses on the floor. There's one where the guy took off, there's one where he landed in the hangar. It didn't do him any good. Emergency jettison systems. The trouble is with these, they're all different. Every aircraft will be different. Some will just be a handle that you can release. Some will be spring-loaded. Some will have explosive bolts. Are they still in your airplane? Can they deteriorate? Can something go wrong? Fire bottles will have squibs in them to set them off. Are they still there? This is where you've got to really start going into depth. Weapon systems. Don't tell me all your weapon systems are safe, because I'll bet they're not. Not long before I finished with the Imperial War Museum, I was in our Manchester branch. One of the young ladies said, "Would you look at that gun turret and see what you think?" I'm not happy with it. There were 250 live rounds. It had been on display in the museum since the war. In London, then in Store, then in Manchester. And that is not unusual. She also asked the guy that went up to double check if he would take them home on the train with him. I won't repeat his answer, but it wasn't terribly polite. So weapons, I mean, there is a national museum in the UK. They've taken the aircraft down now. Not only did they have a Spitfire suspended in their aviation gallery, where the guns were still loaded, one of them was cocked and it had a round in the breech. And it had been out there for a very long time. Because when they went up in the 50s, we didn't think about this sort of thing. So if you've got something that's long-standing, you haven't looked in for a long time, I strongly suggest you double-check it now, because you could easily be horrified at what you find. Plus, of course, flares. There are some flares, and they're very difficult to get rid of in the UK, legally. I've got some in my boat. Well, they're no longer in my boat. They're in my garage. I've got to find somebody that I'm going to have to pay a lot of money to dispose of some out-of-date flares. But Yeah, don't just fire them. Please don't just fire them. Some people will. Other potential hazards. Leaks in the structure allowing water ingress, we've discussed that. Security. I know of a National Aviation Museum. The director, who's a good friend of mine, went in early one morning for some reason, and they just saw a pair of legs disappearing into a bomb bay. A homeless guy had set up home in their aircraft in the museum building. Very easy to do it outside, isn't it? How often do you check in your aircraft? And if somebody's had a rough night, I mean, we were all young once, we've all drank more than we should sometimes and looked for somewhere to sleep other than the railway station platform. It happens. And we discussed manual release systems. Of course, they're not all internal. Some of those are external. So you get a group of kids playing when your museum's shut and something heavy lands on their head. They're not going to get the blame. You are. So that's something else you want to look at. And access. People will want to get in. Is your aircraft secure? Can they actually get into your aircraft easily? Either to set up home, as we've discussed, or to steal components, or just to play. Obviously, radiation, asbestos, PCBs, etc. We all know about those. They are usually the three things that panic people. Do it sensibly, no need to panic. Just control it. You may have a radioactive source that is active through the skin of the aircraft that somebody can get close to. In all probability, it's not going to hurt them. But potentially it could, and then you can get comeback if they decide to look into it. Or you get somebody that's got a little bit of understanding about it, walks past and think, I wonder. It is a potential. Asbestos, especially on the older aircraft, we all know how readily that was used. As I say, I've worked on ships. Asbestos is a major, major problem because it used to be in powder form, put into a big dustbin, water poured in and mixed by hand, and then just slapped on. Fortunately, not the same on aircraft, but always a possibility of asbestos. T-33, Lockheed T-33, is renowned for having radiation contamination in the engine bay because they had radon, is it radon? Radon paint on some of the contact breakers there, and it flaked off over the years. First aid kits are, again, the one that people forget. You could easily have morphine or goodness knows what else in there, or sharps. So be careful with those. Have you removed them? Oh, really having a problem. Right, from the actual object yourself, other potential issues. There's also the risk of the public perception of your museum and therefore your reputation. Taking it a step further, this can have a negative impact on any future grant or funding applications. If you've got a pile of airplanes out on that grass, they are lopsided because one wheel's gone flat and one hasn't, and the paint's peeling off, the fabric's torn, or bits are broken, people aren't going to come in. They're going to look at that and think, look at that rubbish. They don't care about their objects. Why should I go in there? It looks bad. Plus, of course, if you're a serious museum, you're not actually safeguarding your object if you just leave it out there to quietly rot away. As a serious museum, maybe you should look at sending it somewhere else. Right, what can we do to lessen the impact? We can put dehumidifiers in the structure, but you're not going to get all the structure. On an airliner, you might get the cabin. You're You're not going to get all the compartments underneath the floor. You're not going to get out into the wings. On a military aircraft, you're not even going to get that much. So you're going to need a lot of dehumidifiers. Again, more cost. Excuse me. More cost, more time consuming to keep them maintained. You put the electricity there, so you're instantly building in a potential fire hazard. Does it work? Can you solid fill your tyres? I have experimented with that. Mixed results. It can work. It can work. But then again, it can also go horribly wrong. We solid filled the tyres on a Handley Page Hastings. When we tried to move it, the flat on the bottom wouldn't go through the undercarriage legs. So we had a devil's own job then trying to get the wheels off and cut it all out. It's not something I personally would advocate, but I know some people do it and it does work for them. I personally don't do that. All right, have a roster of regular inspections so you know if anything's going to start deteriorating and you can deal with it before it becomes a problem, as opposed to a hole in the skin or something like that. You want to see the damage from inside and look everywhere. Don't just look through a door. Oh, yeah, that's fine in there. Make sure you dig down into your aircraft. You can use inhibiting coatings. Be careful what you use. On the bare aluminium structure, you can use all sorts of things. Paint can be used as a conservation treatment because it can be removed without damaging the substrate if you do it properly. It's not the best way, but it is an option if that's all you've got. But be careful. If you use anything with lanolin in it, there is evidence to suggest that lanolin coming into contact with organic materials, i.e. leather, horsehair, cotton, etc., can break down in the right conditions and create hydrochloric acid. You really don't want little puddles of hydrochloric acid in your airplane. Now, in some confined areas, you can use vapor phase inhibitors, which work. They're good. But again, be careful because you don't know they're designed to work on metal. You don't know what effect they may have on other materials in that area. Plus, of course, they don't work forever. So you've got to change them regularly to keep them efficient and effective. And when I say a closed area, it's got to be an enclosed area, not somewhere with a draft blowing through to clear it all out. They can work in the right condition. Maybe some questions you should ask yourself. Is the aircraft part of your core collection? Is it of particular historical or local importance? If it is, perhaps you should really be considering where you put it outside in the first place. Now, a lot of museums will have a primary or a core collection and a secondary collection. If it's part of your core collection, I would strongly advise that you do not put that airplane outside, because you will lose your historical evidence quite quickly, and over an extended period of time, you will probably lose a lot of your aircraft. Is there an alternative? Is there anywhere else you can put it? Can you get a temporary structure around it? Again, be careful because it's got to be sealed. I've seen a tent over an aircraft that created a sauna because it just sucked all the moisture out the floor, out the ground. Can you afford to lose that aircraft? Can you use it as a sacrificial lamb? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. And that's for you to decide how important that aircraft is to you. If you cannot keep it properly, should you acquire it at all? If you're a responsible museum, you should be saying, actually, I cannot safeguard this object. It's better off going to there or there or there where they can look after it. Even if you own it, you can still send it somewhere else on loan that can look after it for you until you have the right conditions to cancel the loan, bring it back. So is there a better home for it elsewhere? There probably is somewhere. And it's amazing how many people will fight that. I went to a conference in San Diego, and 2 people from a museum, I think it was in Santa Monica, had the only surviving Boeing World Cruiser with its original fabric. And rather than let it go to numerous museums that had offered to take it, they were advocating removing the original fabric, cutting out the insignia and framing it, and covering it with Seconite. And they called themselves a sensible, responsible museum run by museum specialists. I'm not renowned for my tact in diplomacy, so I told them I didn't agree, forcefully. So questions you should be asking there, basically, should we have that aircraft? Can we look after it? Or do we put it somewhere that can? It might be a case of you acquire it, you dismantle it, and you put it in a self-storage place down the road. At least it's being looked after until you can get it on display. There are all sorts of options. Don't just think aviation. Don't just think museum. Think other things as well. If you don't look after your airplane when it's outdoors, this is what you could end up doing. The scaffolding alone, and this was in 1996, cost me £29,000. And that aircraft had only been outdoors for 13 years. I split my staff into 2 shifts, so we worked from 6 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 10 o'clock at night. So I had to pay them shift allowance. I had to hire in dry stripping equipment, you know, like sandblasting, only with plastic media, not sand. More expense. To keep that equipment going, we had 4 nozzles. I only had 4 staff on each shift, so I had to bring in people from an agency to sweep the media and keep charging the machines. Extra expense. The ladies that worked in the offices wanted to be part of the project, so they worked with us in the evening to do the sweeping and recharging. Some of them did the blasting. I had to pay them overtime. I had to pay for the media to do it all. To do that aircraft, that used to be our main display hangar and our entrance to the museum. We had to build a tunnel from the entrance so that people could get into the rest of the museum. We lost all that display space. It was a lot of planning and a lot of work. When I explained it to staff in a staff meeting, somebody said, "Why don't you just scrap it and ask the Americans for another one?" Yeah, right. Never dealt with the Americans, have you? Lovely people, but they have so much red tape on this sort of thing. Plus, of course, who's going to go back and say, "Actually, that multi-million-dollar airplane you loaned to us, we've trashed it. Can you give us another one, please?" They're not going to be on your side, are they? So, mind you, the guys putting the scaffolding up loved it because they'd never had anything like that. They'd only done buildings before. But we did have some issues, again, with the staff. And a couple of people got fired on that project. Don't cross me. Fortunately, the wings on a B-52 are not so much sheet aluminium, but plate. So we could up the pressure and hose the paint off. But this is the sort of problem we came across. We put steel fasteners into an aluminium skin and wonder why it corrodes. We had to dig out loads and loads of corrosion. And the guys were out there for months just grinding it out. Fortunately, mind you, that happens on new airplanes. I spent months sat on the wings of Concorde when I was doing my training, scraping corrosion out of the brand new wing panels before they ever went into service. So this is a sort of problem, the potential problem you can get. How about that one? Same thing, from the B-52, magnesium door, you can see all the corrosion around here. We had to rebuild that door. We could use, wherever possible, we would reuse the fiberglass and all the rest of it that was in there or any other components. We were under a big time constraint on this project, and normally the guys will mark anything they've made with a date and IWM so that in some future date it's not used on a flying aircraft. It's not mistakenly thought, oh my God, it had this, not that. But we didn't have the time, so we used paint. And we used to mix our own paint, and one of the guys got it wrong one day, and he mixed the most disgusting, horrible coloured purple paint that nobody in their right mind would use, so we used that, because we knew then that was something we'd had to repair or remanufacture. But of course, it's not only this, it's all the fastenings that go with it. It's inside that bay, that equipment bay. There was the guys are still working on the aircraft whenever they get the chance. It will be never ending. This isn't an aircraft. This is steel on a coastal 6-inch gun that used to be in Gibraltar, was brought to the Imperial War Museum at Duxford in the 80s, and has effectively been left. It's had a couple of coats of paint. It's corroding. It's getting dangerous. And that's heavy plate steel. It will happen. You will not stop it. That is the wingtip from a Handley Page. No, it's not Handley Page. Victor? Yes, Victor. Handley Page Victor. When I joined the museum in 1990, it was in the process of being repainted by some volunteers who made a pretty good job of it, considering the equipment and the facilities they had at the time. It's not how we would have prepped an aircraft for painting now, but it spent some of its time indoors, some of its time outdoors, backwards and forwards all the time, because the hall it was displayed in was used for corporate events as well, so we're constantly moving it. And that is actually a good part of the aircraft. That isn't. That is a flap track on the same aircraft. Just to replace that one component is going to be months of work to break everything down, get the dimensions, and remanufacture it and reinstall it, just because it's been sat outside for too long. People, I very often found that a lot of people will say, oh no, it's a big object, it'll be okay for ages. It might be a big object, but it's made up of a lot of little objects. It's not a tank, but even they corrode. I had problems with corroding tanks, and trust me, if you get corrosion on a tank track, you're in serious trouble. A quick job on a Mark V First World War tank, I had to employ 4 staff for 18 months working on it full-time to try and get it up to a display standard. That also involved me breaking my elbow and some ribs because I tripped over the cable we used to move it. Hey-ho, life can be so unfair. This is a wheel rim from a B-52. This is where the corrosion will sit. This is where the moisture will quietly fizz away at your wheels. These wheels, as I said earlier, are 265 PSI. I don't know what that is in metric. I don't do metric very often. But there's a lot of force there if that goes bang. My previous boss worked out the explosive force of English Electric Lightning main wheel. Very narrow track, 300 PSI in service, and it was some phenomenal amount of pressure. If that goes bang, somebody is going to get hurt, big time. And in the UK, I believe we've now had one fatality in volunteer aviation museums since they started in the 60s, sadly. So we started a training scheme for them. But I would openly admit that is more by luck than judgment. And we all make mistakes with the best word in the world. I've been in aviation for 44 years, same as a lot of you guys. I know airplanes on the ground bite. I've got fresh scars to prove it. I should know better, but we all get it wrong sometimes. But wheel rims are one of the biggest hazards you are going to have on your aircraft stored outdoors. Guess what we found in the bomb bay of a Vulcan? Doesn't show, and they're only skeletons because we moved it before we found it and the mother never came back. What it doesn't show clearly is a lot of that nest is made up of locking wire and Bowden cable. So these things breaking down have just given, well, before they ended up in that condition, they had drop-ins. Once they started to break down into this condition, they became food for vermin and insects, and that whole thing goes on again. So it's never ending. And finally, this isn't on an aircraft, this is on HMS Belfast. What good is that sign? What's okay? Okay, we'll inspect this area tomorrow. Okay, it's safe, there's no asbestos, there's no radio. What's okay? That is effectively graffiti. It's vandalism. It tells you very, very little, if anything. So if you are going to do surveys and inspections and record it, assume the person that reads it is going to know nothing about it and have very little understanding of how these things work. Because again, with the best will in the world, we all talk jargon in our own field. We all understand these things, and then somebody comes along that knows nothing about it, they won't understand it. When I was an inspector, I used to survey VC-10s to convert them to tankers for the Royal Air Force. And we'd do a survey and we'd write down all the defects. 6 months later, the fitter would come to us and say, oh, where's that one? No idea. That might have been taken away. I don't know. Because I hadn't written it clearly. So be very, very careful if you're writing things like that. But yeah, that is about as much use as an ashtray on a motorcycle. Pointless. Anyone got any questions? If you're going to put a dehumidifier in an aircraft, be careful what sort of dehumidifier you get, because if you get a refrigerant type, in the winter they can freeze up and stop working. They usually have a reservoir that's got to be emptied regularly, or you can have a drain to come out the aircraft, which may freeze up in the winter. The other thing you can do, and I would advocate doing this on aircraft in a building as well, because very few hangars that we have our museums in were designed as museums. So you build a micro environment into your aircraft. So if you repaint, an example being, we had a B-24 come from Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. It had been stood at the side of the parade ground since 1954. Internally was meant to be bare metal. Quite badly corroded. We removed all the corrosion. We treated it and painted it with silver paint. It looks the same, but it's treated. We've created a microenvironment. The guys can now use dry stripping to take that out, and they haven't damaged the original. Or use inhibitors. Create that microenvironment. For corrosion, you need moisture, oxygen, and energy. If you can keep any one of those three out, you're halfway to winning the battle. But you will never win it forever. So keep inspecting. I sound really doom and gloom, don't I? I don't mean to. But if you can build that micro environment and use your imagination, if you have, if you're putting a dehumidifier in there, seal the aircraft best you can, but open up panels. Try and open up as much as you can and duct that air, because you will get still air where no dehumidified air is getting. So you've still got potential problems. So keep that air moving around inside your aircraft. I believe in the 80s, 90s, the Swiss Transport Museum had an aircraft on plinths, and they had a huge dehumidifying plant underneath. And they opened up the wings and all the rest of it. But they also had a lot of maintenance done by Swiss Air, even with all that expense. So open it up, keep the air moving, even if it's just using fans. But you've got to get it out into the extremes, not just the fuselage. And if you're dealing with other materials, think, how can I protect those?
But you mean that dehumidifier is standing inside the airplane?
Yeah.
We were so lucky that in Sweden we have a system with a Vertil 107 that the dehumidifier is standing outside the airplane, and it's putting inside dry air, a little warm.
Yeah, it's
and
good
then
if you can do that.
Goes out.
Yeah.
We have a couple of those machines. I think that's a
well,
good
if you can do that, that is ideal. That's good, because you're then not putting that electrical fire risk in your airplane. And again, think outside the box. The SS Great Britain in my hometown of Bristol is in the original Victorian dry dock she was built in. They do not damp course a dry dock, but they're having problems with this wrought iron ship corroding. What they've done, they put a duct along the keel with vents, and they blow perfectly dry air of about 1 inch depth all over the hull. That's all they need. They do not need to dehumidify the rest. As long as that hull is in dehumidified air, that's all you're going to need on that. So think these things through. But if you can have a dehumidifier with slightly warmed air that you can maintain the RH and the temperature as far as practical, yeah, great. Have it outside. It's better than having it inside.
What is the best coatings for aircraft's metals, for example, for aluminum?
Sadly, there is very little evidence. It's all anecdotal, because whilst our colleagues in fine art and traditional conservation will have conservation scientists to look into all these things for them, we have very rarely had the time to do that, and we've used proprietary things that have worked. And then somewhere down the line, somebody says, actually, that hasn't worked on that one, or it has on that, we use it again. One thing we used, a company called Arrow produced a wax oil that you'd use on cars and seals and what have you. But we mixed it with their inhibiting oil, their equivalent of WD-40, to thin it so we could spray it. We found that worked to treat. For doing inside engines, we used a Worth HS 1200. It came in an aerosol. You could spray it in the spark plug hole, turn the engine over. It was so horrible and sticky. If you turn the engine over, it just coated everything. It's one of those things, if you get it on your hand, you're going to get it in your ear, in your eye, everywhere. It's horrible. But we found that very, very effective. And it will depend on the place you're working and what you can get hold of. It really is a case of just experimenting, but there are usually proprietary materials out there you can use. I have advocated for a very long time that all the industrial type museums, be it aviation, railway, whatever, get together and employ a couple of conservation scientists to actually investigate these things for us and start writing down their findings.
So using the same coatings as we use in the real life when we're having them is the best way.
The only thing we used a lot of, and I would advocate using, that you wouldn't normally get is a Renaissance oil, a microcrystalline wax. colleagues in fine art and traditional conservation use it extensively, and we have found that very, very good. And we would hot wax it. Yeah. Now, from time to time, bearing in mind my wife used to work in the same museum as me, from time to time I'd get in trouble because the ladies would come in to get themselves something for lunch into the canteen, and they'd find an aircraft part in the oven. Got upset, I don't know why. But we would hot wax, and we get the component hot and put the wax on and let it melt in. You cannot always do that. So the other option would be we would coat it with a wax and then put a hairdryer or a hot air gun over it and melt it in that way. And one reason we do that, with New Orleans, what was the hurricane that took them out? Katrina. They had some objects, and I've seen photographs of them that I haven't been able to get hold of, and objects that hadn't been treated were badly corroded. Objects that had just been wiped over with wax oil weren't much better, but the objects that had been hot waxed were almost in pristine condition because they kept all their small artifacts in the basement. And with amazing foresight, when everything was back together and they pumped it all out and everything was fixed, they put all their small artifacts back in the basement. Okay then. But yeah, so Renaissance wax, or a microcrystalline wax, hot wax, we found very, very good. But that won't work on a whole airplane. You could try it. I'd like to see the result. If you do, please, I'll give you my card. If you try it on a whole aircraft, give me a shout. Let me know how it goes.
I just have one other question, which is really just a general question. Paint systems have changed substantially over the years. Do you have any comments about modern paint systems and everything else? Probably along the same lines as vandals, I imagine.
Well, it depends. Again, every object must stand or fall on its own merit. If you've got an aircraft, well, I had a Spitfire delivered, or a pair of Spitfire wings delivered in 24 crates. We had to make a jig and make some wings. We used a modern paint. There was no historical significance in that object. Wherever physically possible, I would like to try and keep the original paint. But we've got to be realistic, we've got to be pragmatic. Sometimes you've got to treat that paint as sacrificial to save the whole. So if you're going to do it, I would suggest you do not use an etch primer because that starts eating into the material, so you are affecting the original substrate. But a modern paint system can be excellent and can be seen as a conservation treatment. And what I would say with that, because you will get purists who will criticize you, what you say to that is, I have been honest about this. I have had to do it. I have not tried to pretend it's the original cellulose paint or anything like that. Nowadays, you can get all the colors you want paint manufactured. You can get matte, semi-matte, high gloss, all the colors. So you can be really pedantic and authentic with colors, but treat the actual paint itself as a conservation treatment. Not the preferred option, but it's better than losing the whole.